44 counties. There are 30% of the 44 counties consist of African Americans. In other words, the African American population among the 44 counties is about 30%. In the history of the court, which was founded in 1790, actually on June 4th, 1790, there has never been a single African American district judge in the Eastern District of North Carolina. There have been 15 judges. Not a single one has been African American. Only one has been female. And so the time has finally come for us to demand that we have an African American judge in the Eastern District, and by confirming Thomas Farr will not further that goal. And so I want to thank all of you for coming today. This is very important to the Congressional Black Caucus and to all of us who understand the importance of an independent judiciary and having a level playing field for those who appear before the court. I served in the courts in North Carolina for 15 years before coming to Congress, and I know so very well the critical importance of having a fair and impartial judge. Because of the history of Thomas Farr, he cannot be a fair and impartial judge, and we stand together in solidarity. We want to publicly thank the sponsors who have put together this event today. I want to thank my colleagues in the House and Senator Booker and Senator Harris and others in the United States Senate for their strong work. We will be heard on this confirmation. Amen. Thank you so very much.
Amen.
Yeah. It is now my pleasure to introduce an individual who is my friend, my son, my constituent. He's a minister. He's now a national and international leader. All of you know him as Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. Reverend Barber.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Today I'm humbled to stand here with all of those who have come on this critical day, and I come here today representing Repairs the Breach and the Poor People's Campaign. Let us be very clear. By the Trump administration nominating Thomas Farr for the federal bench and Republican members of the Judicial Committee pushing his name forward, it is an attempt to stack the courts with a lawyer who has a known history of supporting systemic racism, voter suppression, and anti-worker, flawed and unconstitutional legal theories. To push him forward is to support a nomination and to nominate a candidate contrary to the principles of Abraham Lincoln and contrary to the Republicans who first supported the Voting Rights Act in 1960. The nomination of Thomas Farr is to go far beyond the words of racism. Sometimes we get so caught up in the words of racism. But the nomination of Tom Farr is to do the work of racism. And anyone who supports his and promotes his nomination, in spite of his known and lengthy career, fostering policies of systemic racism and anti-worker policies, cannot claim to be against racism. To support Farr is to support racism, disparate treatment, and anti-worker policies.
That's right.
It is to do that in the 21st century. And he has no place to have a lifetime appointment on the bench. Furthermore, to support Farr would be to support an anti-woman agenda, and specifically an anti-black woman agenda. President Obama sought to desegregate this court, but Senators Tom Tillis and Richard Burr blocked the hearings for two highly qualified African-American women nominated by President Obama. I want the media to hear that. These women were not even given the opportunity for a hearing. Jennifer May Parker, who was the chief of the appellate division at the United States Attorney's Office in the Eastern District, where I'm from, and Patricia Timmons Goodson, a former state Supreme Court justice. These two women were not even given a hearing. Tillis and Burr blocked them. Thomas Farr, who has a deep, ugly history of supporting and defending the works of racism, now the Trump administration and Republican members of the Judicial Committee want to reward him with the federal bench of the Eastern District of North Carolina, a district which covers an area in which about half of North Carolina's African Americans reside and is often referred to as the state's Black Belt. It is a place, however, that even today in 2018, when you look at the federal bench, it looks like the civil rights movement never happened. Farr has also been the lead attorney in a series of recent legislative efforts to suppress political participation by African Americans and Latinos and even women in the state. He does not have a history of doing this. He has recent activity doing this. In 2010, Farr advised the General Assembly in what the federal courts later termed a racial gerrymander of the North Carolina House, Senate, and U.S. Congressional District. This gerrymander gave extremist voters voter-proof majority, and like the latter, voter suppression was pushed by Tom Tillis, who was Speaker then and became Senator later. In separate lawsuits, each of these redistricting plans were determined to have discriminated against African American voters. In 2013, the North Carolina General Assembly enacted a bill that shortened early voting and eliminated same-day voter registration and did away with out-of-precinct voting and required voters to present government-issue IDs, but it was so harsh that even an ID at North Carolina Central University or the University of North Carolina would not be accepted. All of these were techniques known to suppress black, brown, women, and poor voters. Farr advised the legislature on the bill and then became the lead counsel in a 3-year battle to defend it. If Pender Harris here, I want her to step up beside me. He argued openly on court. He argued, Senator Booker, he argued that retrogression was legal. In a federal courtroom, he stood up and said to the judge, retrogression is legal, especially now that the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. And since the Shelby decision. I was president of the NAACP at that time. Pender Harris, with Forward Justice, was lead counsel. And the Supreme Court ruled that the law he wrote and was defending was unconstitutional. It was an intentional racial attempt to disenfranchise African American voters with almost surgical precision. While we don't yet know what Russia did, we know what racialized voter suppression has done, and Farr has been at the center of voter suppression all his legal career. Farr's recent work for voter suppression is the culmination of an entire career spent advocating the cause of policy-based, yes, white supremacy. Because white supremacy is not when somebody calls you the N-word. White supremacy is when you implement laws that create disparate impact on black and brown people. He was a part of efforts in our state. He began his career as an aide to Senator Jesse Helms. When Jesse Helms urged white people to wake up, Helms was notorious for his diatribe against Negro hoodlums and forced integration and touting for the purely scientific statistical evidence of natural racial distinction in group intellect. He became the state's most ferocious opponent of the civil rights movement. In 1983, Helms filibustered the proposed Martin Luther King holiday, calling King an action-oriented Marxist. The following year, Thomas Farr became a Helms protege, joined as legal counsel to his U.S. Senate campaign, during which Senator Helms publicly expressed his gratitude for the support of the Ku Klux Klan. Farr served in the same capacity for Helms' race-baiting 1990 campaign, which ran the now infamous White Hands ad, a racist television spot designed to inflame white voters' anxiety over Helms' African-American opponents, Harvey Grant, suggesting that black folk were taking jobs from white people. Lastly, during Farr's time on the campaign, the Helms Campaign Committee sent more than 105,000 postcards to African Americans, wrongly warning that they were ineligible to vote and could be arrested for voter fraud if they appeared at the polls. Farr lied and said he had no knowledge of the effort. But a former Department of Justice official said that the Helms disciple absolutely was involved in this and earlier illegal voter suppression tricks that the campaign described as ballot security efforts. Thomas Ellis, who was Farr's law partner, was Helms' deputy for 50 years. He served as board chair of the Nazi-inspired pro-eugenics Pioneer Fund and used funding from that foundation to create and bankroll vast networks of interlocking organizations to support Helms and other political candidates who espoused the notion of a superior white race and opposition to civil rights. Finally, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the nation's leading authority on race-hate groups, found deep connections between Farr and these groups. Now, Farr is genteel. He does not raise his voice. He will probably never be heard using the N-word or racial epithet. But his commitment to the policies of systemic racism and robbing people of their rights is chronic and dangerous to the principles of our democracy. Thomas Farr is a person with a track record of opposition to civil rights, and to allow him to take a judgeship in Eastern District, North Carolina, the courts, would be to erect a living monument to racism in the heart of the Black Belt of North Carolina, where the greatest percentage of the state's African-American population resides. In essence, it would be like putting the fox over the hen house, and it would be to reward him for his extreme legal views about racism and anti-worker policies. We should not appoint Farr, and anyone who supports him and votes for him cannot claim they are against racism. They must own that to support Farr is to support systemic racism and anti-worker policies.
All right.
Senator Cory Booker, we invite him to come.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I don't know if I need to inform everybody this, but this is not an academic lecture.
That's right.
This is a rally. So can I hear some people talk? All right. Are you ready to match brute force with our soul force?
Yeah.
Are you ready to match their politician power with our people power?
Yeah.
Are you ready to match persistent hate with our unyielding love?
Yeah.
All right, then let's hear it. This is a rally out here right now. This is a great tradition that our founders wrote into the Constitution. The right of the people to petition their government. The right of people to speak up against ills. We are going to use our power today. And now more than ever, we are at a moral moment in our country. Let me say it again. This is a moral moment in our country. We are really at a crossroads. There is so much change going on. And fundamental elements of our democracy are under assault. The Article 3 branch of government is the judiciary, and there has been long traditions in the United States Senate that are being broken right now. There are long traditions of bipartisan coming together to make sure that the judiciary is a place where sound minds, balanced judgment, and good hearts prevail. And now we are seeing an assault on the judiciary as President Trump, at a blistering, record-breaking pace, is changing the face of the American judiciary, putting in people of young age and extreme views. Donald Trump has nominated and confirmed more circuit court judges in his first year in office than any president in the history of our country. And they're being confirmed by trashing Senate norms. And there are people that are representatives of the extreme of our country. And also, it should be of note that at a time that the nation is becoming more diverse, we're seeing more women in the United States Congress, we're seeing more minorities in the United States Congress, at a time that from the boardroom to the Senate rooms, we're seeing diversity. The group that Donald Trump has put on the bench is the least diverse group of any president, Democratic or Republican, since 1980. Are we going to sit by on the sidelines and tolerate this?
No.
Well, look, we see now our judiciary being turned into a bench of extremists who don't not just believe in, but have been doing everything they can to assault voting rights, civil rights, environmental rights, women's rights. These nominees express a serious effort to undermine the truth of who we are as a nation. And there is no more serious example of Donald Trump's efforts to reshape the judiciary than the person we've been talking about here today, Thomas Farr in the Eastern District of North Carolina, a district that is incredibly diverse. Close to a third of its people are African American. And we have seen now a 150-year history in that district where no women have been there but one, where good women have been nominated, Obama, 2 overqualified African American women blocked, where no African Americans at all have ever served. And now, while this lack of diversity in the district is disappointing, and some might even find it insulting that in 150 years you couldn't come up with more than one qualified woman or one qualified African American in a district that's almost a third black. But the most serious, most difficult, most angering aspect of this is that Farr has, in his legal career, worked to weaken civil rights protections, weaken protections for workers and everyday Americans on behalf of corporate interests. And he has assaulted voting rights, assaulted workers' rights, working to suppress the democratic political voices of disadvantaged communities. And we know, as we've heard, that this isn't just a sometimes part of Thomas Farr's career. His entire career has been a decades-long, methodical, repeated effort to weaken civil rights protections, erode anti-discrimination protections, suppress the vote in communities of color, and attack workers' rights to organize. In a report about Mr. Farr's nomination, the Alliance for Justice wrote very simply, "It would be difficult to identify an attorney in all of North Carolina whose career is more closely associated with the attack on vulnerable citizens." In one instance, as a private attorney, he was a private attorney in North Carolina. He went out of his way to file an amicus brief. Hold on, Kamala. To file an amicus brief in a suit that challenged a California labor law that established the right of state employees to organize. He has been working in every point of his career to undermine those rights, not only the rights of Americans, but the rights that Americans sweat for and bled for, and some Americans have died for. Mr. Farr, as we've heard, was the legal counsel to Jesse Helms when Jesse Helms did something that was utterly morally offensive. It was moral vandalism what Helms did. He sent over 120,000 postcards to black North Carolina voters, suggesting that they were not only ineligible to vote, and they were not, but threatened criminal prosecution if they showed up. This is a despicable and illegal campaign tactic. Now, Farr has denied involvement, but the discrepancies between his testimony to the Judiciary Committee and the historical record raise questions that are still unanswered. And most recently, we heard the great Reverend Barber talk about this. He represented the state of North Carolina in a federal appeals court case and lost one of the biggest cases of his career, a case defending the state's notorious anti-discrimination voter ID law, because the court found, and I quote, that the state was acting with almost surgical precision to undermine the votes and the rights and the sacred privileges of citizenship of African Americans. And so I say, we are at a time of crisis. If confirmed, this judge, like all judges, will have the opportunity to shape and define the character of our country, the power of a lifetime appointment of a federal judge to affect the outcomes of our democracy, to touch generations not yet born. This is one of the most powerful positions in the United States of America. If confirmed, Farr will have the opportunity to affect the lives and livelihoods of everyday Americans. If confirmed, he will stand in the balance and have the power to decide. The power to decide either to suppress or protect the rights of Americans who are exercising their right to vote. He'll have the power to decide to either affirm or deny the rights of Americans to breathe clean air and drink clean water. He'll have the power to decide to either establish or undermine freedoms from discrimination. He'll have the power to decide to either strengthen or weaken one's ability to make their own decisions about health care, about who they love, and about how we pray. That's the power that he will have to decide. But I tell you right now, we have the power to decide. As James Baldwin said, yes, indeed. As James Baldwin said at the end of The Fire Next Time, everything we now must assume is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. People may say that what I'm asking is impossible, but in today's day and age, the impossible is the least we can demand, because human history is, after all, and American Negro history is, as Baldwin wrote, a perpetual testimony to the achievement of the impossible. And so we now have a decision to make. My brothers and sisters, we now have a decision to make. Will we be silent in the face of this incredible nominee?
No.
All right, or will we speak up?
Speak up.
We must decide, folks. It's our decision to let apathy or inaction be our way, or will we rise up?
Rise up.
Will we rise up for justice?
Yes.
Will we rise up for love?
Yes.
Will we rise up against discrimination?
Yes.
We must decide to either sit down as spectators in the course of human events in this moral moment, or will we stand up?
Stand up.
Will we stand up for the rights of all Americans? Will we stand up for voting rights? Will we stand up for civil rights? Will we stand up for workers' rights? Because now we have to raise our voices and demand. You know what Frederick Douglass said: power concedes nothing without a demand. Those who profess to favor freedom yet deprecate agitation are like those who want the crops without the tilling of the soil. They're like those who want the rain without the thunder and the lightning. They're like those who want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. Frederick Douglass said this is going to be a struggle, and I'm telling you right now, we've got to struggle. We've got to work. We've got to sweat. The opposite of justice is not injustice. It's inaction. It's indifference. It's apathy. We have the power. The power of the people is always greater than the people in power. And so I ask you right now, this is a time that we who believe in the ideals of this country, we who believe in equal justice under the law, we who believe ultimately that we are one nation under God, indivisible, committed to the principles of ideals of liberty and justice for everyone, we now must decide. And I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, there's only one thing we must decide. There's only one thing we can do. It's to pour forth our soul force to make sure that we stop this injustice of having a man like Farr serve on the highest court in the land.
Stop hating.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored now to bring up one of my great partners. She is a sister of soul and spirit. She is someone who is tireless voice for justice and advocacy for what is right in America. My partner on the Judiciary Committee, a trailblazer, a glass ceiling breaker, and someone who's always rising, Senator Kamala Harris.
Reverend Barber and Reverend Booker. So, listen, look at that building over there. It's the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And inscribed there are the words equal justice under the law. We will not get that with Farr. We will not get that. I think we all know this is a pivotal moment in the history of our country. We're living in a pivotal moment in the history of our country. I think of this as being a moment in time similar to the moment in time when my parents met when they were active in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I think of this as being that moment in time that one of the people that inspired me to be a lawyer when he lived, marched, and worked, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, Constance Baker Motley. those Americans who understood the power of the skill of the profession of law and what happens in the courtrooms of America. The power that we have to make sure the passion from the streets is translated into those courtrooms in a way that we fight for and achieve justice for all. That is all at risk with this nomination and so many others that this administration has pulled out. And let's be clear about this, guys. At this inflection point in our country, at this moment right now, our democracy is under attack.
Yes, it is.
Yep.
Our democracy is under attack. Now just step back and think for a moment. If you think about our democracy, the republic, as a tabletop, it stands on 4 legs. 3 independent, co-equal branches of government, and a free and independent press. Systematically, this administration is trying to cut the legs, those 4 legs upon which our democracy stands. So let's see this for what it is and understand it for what it is. And as it relates to this and so many of the appointments this administration has made to our courts, it is clearly a systematic and intentional attempt to destroy our democracy. And why? Well, one, you've heard about the people who are being nominated, and in particular this individual, Farr, and why he is not qualified and should be disqualified from this appointment. So you know that man's record. You know what that is about. He clearly does not appreciate and understand those words equal under the law. His record on race, his record on gender, his record on workers' rights tell us he cannot be a fair and impartial and unbiased administrator of justice. But we can look beyond that. Cory and I sit now as the first 2 in almost 2 decades African Americans to sit on Senate Judiciary. And we've been sitting there watching and listening to the people this administration is appointing. 2/3 of the appointments have been white men, not reflective of the population of the country and those who all should seek and receive equal treatment under the law. We have seen nominees come forward who have been designated as unqualified by bar associations. We have seen people who refuse to agree that Brown versus Board of Education, without which I would not be standing here, by the way, Cory would not be standing here, had a court of law not decided that case. And we have nominees who have come before us to the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate who have refused to agree that is precedent. Our democracy is under attack. Our democracy is under attack. So when we look at this, we have to understand, yes, Brother Cory, we must fight. We must fight. We must fight.
Amen.
We cannot lay down at this moment. This is an inflection moment in the history of our country. And the other piece then is this, understanding that this administration has now, I'm told, appointed more people to the courts of the United States than the last 5 presidents of the United States. That's stacking the courts. This is going to have generational impact. Just like Brown v. Board of Education allows me and Cory and so many of us to stand here today, years from now, the decisions that come down from these courts will impact our babies and our grandbabies. Yes. There is so much at stake right now at this moment. And so we must fight, and we cannot lay down, and we cannot be tired. Let's remember those beautiful words of Coretta Scott King. I'll paraphrase, but she famously said, "The fight for civil rights must be fought and won with each generation." Yes. And when she said that, she had 2 points in mind. One, it is the very nature of this fight for civil rights, for equality, this fight for justice, that whatever gains we make, they will not be permanent. And so the second point then is understanding that let us not despair. Let's not get tired. Let's keep this fight up. Let's keep our energy up because we know we are better than this. And let's close this point with saying this. This fight is about love of country. This fight is about a belief in our democracy and the promises of our democracy. This fight is about fighting for the future of our country. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
And now I am proud to introduce an incredible leader, especially at this moment in time, the President and CEO of the NAACP, Derrick Johnson.
Good afternoon.
NAACP.
You know, with the complete loss of civility in the political discourse, with the election of Donald Trump, the reality is sitting in with all of these federal nominees. Never have we seen a nominee as offensive as Thomas Farr since the nomination of Robert Bork. Thomas Farr is counter all of the progress we've made over the last 50 years. An individual who simply don't respect the rights of African Americans, do not uphold the values of individuals to collectively bargain, completely disrespect the right of women to make choices, and operate in a fashion that is counter to democracy. If this Senate approved this nomination, every member of the United States Senate who vote for Thomas Farr also adopt an anti-democracy agenda. And for the NAACP, an organization that's 109 years old, who've built our legacy on fighting for the rights of all individuals being afforded equal opportunity under the law, it is a reality for us that our fight must continue as long as individuals who hold the values of Thomas Farr are able to occupy a seat that is a lifelong appointment. We stand here not for the first time to oppose this nominee. For earlier this year, 2 busloads of individuals drove from North Carolina, the Eastern District, where Thomas Farr is being appointed, to express their concerns. Those concerns were already cataloged by Dr. Barber, an individual who've done all he could to prevent the right of African Americans to cast their ballots. So we're calling on citizens from across the country to work with us to restore civility in the political discourse, not stand with this president's agenda to sow hate among communities, to allow foreign nations to tamper with our elections and to subvert democracy. So thank all of you who've traveled from across the country to stand in opposition to this nominee, an individual who is being nominated from the Eastern District of North Carolina, because like you, we understand injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And for those reasons, and many others that have already been stated, we oppose this nominee, and we call on all right-thinking U.S. senators to stand with justice, stand with democracy, and stand with humanity, and not support this nomination. Thank you.
I'm very now proud to bring to the microphone one of the great leaders for civil rights, for women's rights, for American rights that we have in America, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Senator. And if I could say, I'm here for the Congressional Black Caucus. You've heard from our member whose district Tom Farr would sit, but I'm here for the entire Black Caucus, and the Black Caucus does not just consist of House members. The 2 senators you see here are very important members of our caucus. The fact that our caucus has been strengthened by having senators is very important to us. But I do want you to know that the Congressional Black Caucus does not come to this triangle every time this president has nominated a judge, someone to be a judge with whom we disagree. If that were the case, we'd have a permanent place on this triangle. So by coming here, we hope you understand how important this is to us. I say to my 2 Senate friends, And I particularly say to those of you who are here, because they say, you know, what are we going to do about it? I tell you what you can do about it. Make sure that you send us a different Senate in November. That's the only way we can do something about it, because we can't do anything about this man now, except what our senators can do to slow up his nomination. Our House members, obviously, can go on the Senate floor, and we intend to go on the Senate floor. But only you can send us a Senate that will not let a man like this see the light of day in the Senate or anywhere in the Congress of the United States. Please do that for us if you have come here. We ask you to help us as we now stand to keep a man who has spent his entire life trying and largely succeeding in disenfranchising African Americans. And I ask you, in light of what this president's record has been, we don't expect Republican presidents to nominate as many African Americans as Democratic presidents, but we don't expect this track record. The president has nominated almost 92% of his nominees have been white for the circuit and district courts. 1%, my friends, have been African American. Now, Republicans didn't nominate large numbers of African Americans, but at least they had a show of understanding of what our country is about. We've never had anything like this. And as if that weren't bad enough, to essentially have no African Americans to be appointed to the bench with Tom Farr, this president has hit a new low. He was nominated before and didn't make it. And now, even in this crowd of nominees that we oppose, he stands out like a sore thumb. And he will be for a lifetime doing what he has done as a lawyer. You have heard of the notorious 100,000 postcards that warned African Americans not to go to the polls. He has used his lawyerly skills against African Americans throughout his time as a lawyer. You know, there are not many quotable lines in court decisions. The line, "all deliberate speed," is one we all remember. The line that was used for the work of Tom Carr, who tried to keep African Americans from voting in North Carolina, was that the work of the state had been marked by almost surgical precision to keep African Americans from voting. I won't even begin to tell you how he has spread his hatred of equality to women, to everyone in sight. I can only say that with all that our senators are doing and can do to slow up this nomination, there is really more you can do to keep the Tom Farr from seeing the light of day after November 2018. And I ask you to do that for us, for the American people. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to introduce you to one of our great unsung heroes in the United States of America, especially over the last couple years. Truly someone who is doing a tremendous job trying to stop the affronts to civil rights, to voting rights, to women's rights, to civil rights. Again, one of my favorite presidents in all of Washington, D.C., Kristen Clark, who is the President Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Clark. I'm President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, and we are here today because we reject President Trump's attempt to hijack our courts with radical, biased, and unqualified nominees who fall far outside the mainstream. President Trump is actively working to stack our courts with judges who may change our courts for a generation to come. The radicalization of our courts stands as one of the gravest threats to democracy today. The courts touch virtually every aspect of our lives. Judges hear courts dealing with our civil rights, with criminal justice issues, voting rights, LGBT rights, reproductive rights, women's rights, and so much more. We must all care about this president's coordinated attack on our courts. It's time for the Senate to do its job and properly vet nominees who are being installed on our courts for lifetime appointments. And I want to thank Senators Booker and Harris for speaking truth to power and using their voice on the Senate Judiciary Committee to expose the bias that stains the record of so many of these radical nominees. President Trump is reversing course on efforts to promote judicial diversity across our country. The president's slate of nominees have been virtually all white and all male. Look around you. This does not reflect the growing diversity that we see across our country today. We are literally seeing this administration pull us back into the Jim Crow era. But today, we're here to focus on one judge who is most undeserving of a lifetime appointment, and that's Thomas Farr. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Farr is the poster child for voter suppression in our country today. Farr's supporters will tell you that his qualifications to serve should be judged based on his merits, but his record speaks for itself. An examination of his record makes clear that he cannot be entrusted with the awesome responsibility of being fair and impartial with respect to the cases that would come before him. Frankly, I can't identify a single other attorney in North Carolina whose career is more closely associated with attacks on the voting rights of minority communities. A protege of Jesse Helms, the former North Carolina senator, Farr has spent his career representing the likes of him and others who suppress and dilute the African American vote in North Carolina. As you heard, in 1992, he served as a lawyer for the Jesse Helms campaign at a time in which they mailed out more than 100,000 postcards to mostly black voters, suggesting that they would be subject to criminal prosecution for voting in the midterm election. We watched as he misled the Senate Judiciary Committee on this point about his role, denying any awareness of those postcards, but a Justice Department attorney who handled the investigation said that he was closely involved in the scheme as it developed. He defended the state's monster voter suppression law, which was found by a federal appeals court to have discriminated against minority voters with almost surgical precision. At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, we know him very well. In a case, North Carolina versus Strzok, we sued the state of North Carolina for violating the National Voter Registration Act. And guess who they hired to defend them? Thomas Farr. He has established himself as the go-to attorney for efforts to dilute African American votes and efforts to make it more difficult for minority communities to participate. Whether we're talking about violations of federal voting rights laws, voter intimidation, or voter suppression, Thomas Farr is the hired gun for efforts that involve attacks on voting rights today. His extensive work to undermine the rights of African American voters is especially striking when we think about the obstruction of President Obama's judicial nominees, two overwhelmingly qualified African American women, Jennifer May Parker and Patricia Timmons Goodson. If confirmed, Thomas Farr's biased and radical ideology will metastasize. It will spread from his post, infect the North Carolina courts, and undermine the rule of law. We reject attempts to place him on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, and senators who support him must be held accountable. Thomas Farr has promoted an anti-civil rights, an anti-women's rights, an anti-voting rights, anti-worker rights, anti-LGBTQ rights agenda for years. What will he do with your rights with a lifetime appointment on the bench? The Senate must reject his nomination. I ask you to stand with me and call on the Senate to protect our courts. Protect our courts. Protect our courts. Protect our courts. Thank you.
I saved her from having to introduce me, so let me just say, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, I'm a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and I certainly want to thank Ms. Clark for the eloquent expose of the reasons why, and to thank the civil rights leaders who are here, and Senator Booker and Senator Harris, and our national organizations. And so I will just briefly take you down memory lane so that you can answer the philosophical question, or the question that so many of us fear: what the heck do you have to lose? And that is the question that should drive us in masses to call the senators of the United States Senate, to reach out to our constituencies and simply pose to them what the heck you have to lose. Might I also say, why don't you pose to them, is the dreamer's dream alive? Is Dr. King's dream alive? Then you might conclude with the words of Robert Francis Kennedy, of which I heard today, when people will ask him why, he wanted to give them the question, why not? We've got to drive the forces of goodwill to recognize what we have potentially in a lifelong appointee of Mr. Farr. Now, I would take you further down memory lane. Be reminded of who had rights in 1860. Not many of us standing here today had any rights in 1860. From the LGBTQ, from women, from immigrants, from the disabled, from African Americans, from women, from people of faith who had different faith. What rights did you have? Possibly what rights, after Reconstruction disintegrated, did you have in 1890s? What rights did you have in the beginning of the 19th century when Jim Crow raised its head and clamored and embraced every group that was different? Jim Crow wanted to attack. And then, as you have proceeded in the 1984 race with Governor Hunt in North Carolina, when you begin to know who this gentleman was, and ran one of the most racist campaigns ever that is blistering and still internalized, I imagine, in the people of North Carolina. Might you imagine that this individual also has reached across the nation to stand against workers' rights? So I will end on the memory lane. I hope that you're still standing and that people who are listening are still standing to be reminded of the fact that if we don't take a stand, though we don't know the ultimate outcome of this, they will know that the voices of people who believe in a new America, who understand the value of these words, first of all, to stop the hate, and then, which I think should be the calling of every American who believes in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, is that we must demand justice. And in this confirmation proceeding, I can be assured that justice will not prevail. But if you raise your voices and take yourself down memory lane, I would imagine that you will be motivated, and all of your constituents will be motivated to say that enough is enough, and demand justice we must. We who are on the judiciary committees know what the impact will be, and I know that you know what the impact will be.
Thank you very much, Representative Lee. Thank you to Representative Norton, Representative Butterfield. On behalf of Demand Justice, the NAACP, Repairers of the Breach, and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, we thank all of you for joining us today to hear what we have to say. But now the most important thing is to take the next step and to take action and make sure that the senators hear what we have to say. With that, we have live streamed this for folks who want to find it. It is on Twitter and Facebook. We are at We Demand Justice. You should also follow the other organizations at NAACP, at Be Repairers, and at LawyersComm, COMM. And thank you once again for being with us. Have a nice day.
Yeah, no, it's obviously the Farr nomination. Yeah. So, I just want to make sure.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was here for most of it.
Interns, come here. Quick.
What? I know there was talk that he might run like four judges.
Yes. You good? Yeah, I'll talk.
If enough people have said, I'm not sure about this, and then McConnell says, Senator, let's go round up the vote. I do think that once you
Yay, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
public speak, right? So I think we'll see here. That's all.